My name is Brian Loomis, and I am from a company in Boise, Idaho called Virtual Relations. This will be the second year that I presented at the Lasso conference. I also spoke on L-Migrator last year in Chicago. And what I want to talk to you guys today is about how to use @begin to invoke URL routing and REST. How many of you guys here have heard of REST before? Do you guys know what that is? Okay, a couple of you. Chris knows, I'm sure. How many people have heard of Roy Fielding? Is that name familiar to anybody?
Excuse me?
Roy Fielding? Roy Fielding is one of the co-founders of the Apache project. And so what I want to talk about is a URL versus a URI. And this kind of has to do with how we have, what we call a URL in the browser. People cut and paste something in an email, they send it to you, it's a link. But there's a little bit different way that these can be looked at. And a URI is a resource that asks for an action. It's a specific, kind of a stateful request, and it expects a certain thing back in return. And a URL is a file or a single item that's stateless. And so an example of that would be, a graphic, a logo, something like that. That image file is it's always going to be there. And I think I mixed these up. Sorry, I've been working on this. And a URL is a single file or an item that's stateless. So if you just can, in your mind, imagine that these examples are opposite there, then it'll make a lot more sense. Sorry about that. So with the URL versus a URI is a resource that asks for action, and a URL is a file or a single item that's stateless. Now, when we make a request to the browser, I'm glad that Bill kind of covered the HTTP request cycle, because that has to do a lot with what I'm going to talk about. And there's kind of three different things that go on here when you make a browser request. When you get the URL on the server, you can handle the URL, you can rewrite the URL, or you can redirect it. And so handling the URL is it's conceptually parsing a URI to see what application components to call to provide a resource. And rewriting a URL is actually altering a URL to a different URL before it even hits the application stack. So for example, like when LassoSoft put up the new site, they have a bunch of old links all around the internet. And so you have to rewrite those URLs to point them to the new one. And so that happens, it can happen in the Lasso URL rewrite, or it can happen in Apache using mod rewrite. But it actually alters the URL to a different one before it's requested. And then the third one is redirecting a URL. So you can actually receive one URL and then redirect it and point it somewhere else. So @begin is it's a file, it's a process, it's a methodology for handling all kinds of different things, but it is basically a preprocessor for Lasso. You have @begin, you have @end, and the @end is the post-processor. But the @begin component, you take a file, you name it @begin.lasso, and you place it in the Lasso startup. And the @begin file will actually have a specific command in it, and I'll show you that in a second. And you define an @begin action. So this is an example of a real simple @begin file. And so you see, you have the opening, define @begin, and then you have some actions based on the response file path. So you can use something really, really simple like this, or you can, if you want to, make it very, very complex. And as applications grow, this will change also. And so you need to be able to modify this and scale with it and make some changes. But so here we're basically looking at this. We're seeing anything that ends with .lasso, do it normally. Anything that ends with .lasso app, send it to Lasso. If it's .inc, if it's .las, then we do this. If it's not those, then we process it here, and we send it to our application controller. And so this is a file that's in our application framework. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about our framework single track on Sunday in the lightning talk. But we have a way to handle all the requests and funnel them through this one part of the application, and this is the application controller. And so along with this, you have to make some configurations to Apache to allow this to work right. You can do the Apache config file, or if you're in a shared hosting environment where you don't have to do that, you can use htaccess. I'm not going to cover htaccess. I'm just going to show you the Apache config file that we use. And this is what this looks like. So we have, we have a spot here where we check for extensionless URLs, ones that end in a slash, ones that don't end in a slash. And we also make sure that they have no more than 245 characters. And there's a reason for that. I don't remember, it was on a list a long time ago, but it had to do, I think, with Internet Explorer.
As always.
Right. So you put this in, the config for the Apache config for this site, and then you put the @begin file in the startup folder for Lasso. You restart the Lasso site, restart Apache, and then it will start to apply those rules to the requests that come into the browser. Okay, so the @begin stuff is really pretty basic. You can make it simple or you can make it complicated depending on what you need to do. But the reason to do it is this thing called REST. And this is what Fielding, he wrote a paper about REST. And REST stands for Representational State Transfer. And so what REST does is it's kind of the underpinnings of HTTP. It's not HTTP itself, but HTTP is a very good example of how REST should work. And so REST, really what it describes is it describes a way to map to resources and to actions. And it's about using the true potential of HTTP. And so we have, we have these terms called RESTful, RESTful resources, RESTful application. But basically what that means is that it just boils down to following a standard and a convention with your URLs and your requests. And so in a RESTful application, you never modify data using a GET request. You only modify data using POST requests. And some of you guys may have experienced this. If you have an application that gets crawled by a bot and suddenly things look really weird in the database, it's because you have resources in the application that can be modified using a GET request. And a hyperlink is just a real good example of a GET request. And so you never want to have destructive actions unless they're behind a POST request.